Welcome to Masters of Creativity, everybody. It's awesome to see you all. I'm Jeremy, and I'm joined by the amazing Annie Murphy-Paul. I'll spotlight us here so that folks can see us. We've got Annie here, and for those of you, I'm sure everybody knows you signed up for the session, but just in case you don't, Annie Murphy-Paul is an acclaimed science writer whose work has appeared in a bunch of incredible publications like the New York Times Magazine, Scientific American, the Best American Science Writing, and many others. She's here today to talk about her latest book, which is called The Extended Mind, The Power of Thinking Outside the Brain. And in her real job, her full-time job, she's actually currently a senior writer with the amazing NPR radio program and podcast called Hidden Brain. I have loved reading her book and loved learning from her, and I'm delighted to get to invite Annie to the stage. Welcome, Annie. With that, I'll have you take it away. And don't be surprised if I spotlight myself and interrupt, because this is going to be a robust discussion, I know.
Got it. Thanks, Jeremy. I'm so glad to be here. Really excited.
So I would say let's start with give us the premise of The Hidden Brain. Give us a little bit of background. Why did you write the book, and what do you mean by The Hidden Brain? Perhaps
the extended mind.
Sorry.
I know they're very similar, and now everyone mixes them up. So that's just
I can't be the first person to do that.
No, you're not. Yeah. So the extended mind is an idea that originated in philosophy. Two philosophers, Andy Clark and David Chalmers, first proposed it back in 1998. And I remember really well coming across that article that introduced the idea of the extended mind. It grabbed me with its very first line. It said, "Where does the mind end and the rest of the world begin?" And that to me was a very provocative and, challenging question, because it would seem to have an obvious or a conventional answer, which is that the mind, stops at the skull. It's the mind and the brain are more or less identical, right? And so thinking is contained, the mind is contained in here. But Clark and Chalmers were saying, they were arguing, no, that's not the case. Actually, our mind extends beyond the skull into the movements and sensations of our bodies, into our physical surroundings, into our relationships with other people, and into our tools and our devices. And these mental extensions, if we can use them with skill and intention, can allow us to think better. At least that's the kind of practical take on the extended mind that I wanted to bring to my book.
And so you see, maybe the first question I'll ask you, you see this piece, you were gripped by the first sentence. How does that revelation start to work its way into your thinking, into how you interact with the world? I mean, it's one thing. I've been gripped by a lot of articles this morning, right? How does one go from being gripped by an article or a line or an unexpected, proposition to getting to the point where you expended a great deal of time and effort to illuminate some of these principles for us? How did you go from inspiration to deciding, this is a book?
Yeah, that's a great question, because you're right. Lots of things come across the transom, right, in all of our lives every day. And what is it that grabs you and doesn't let go, which was the case for the extended mind and me. I think I did experience that article and that first line as a kind of challenge, because I was what Andy Clark calls a brain-bound kind of person, in the sense that I really did imagine that thinking happened only in our heads. Before I joined Hidden Brain, I was a freelance writer for a couple of decades, and I worked in a very solitary way. I'm a reader and thinker, so I live in my head. I can very easily forget that I have a body, or that I'm located in physical space because of the all that's going on up here. But so I experienced it as a challenge that really kind of provoked me to think more deeply. Well, is that true? And if it is the case that our minds extend beyond our skulls, what would that mean? What would that mean for how I work? What would that mean for how I live? What would that mean for how I relate to other people? And so the book became a way of exploring those questions. And by the end, I would say that I was a convert, to this at first very odd seeming idea that the mind extends beyond the skull. The conversion came about through the process of reading and gathering and synthesizing all these research findings from psychology and cognitive science and a bunch of other disciplines that suggested that this really is the case, that it really is too limited and limiting to think of, to imagine that thinking only happens inside the skull. And so, sorry, my cat is thinking outside his brain right now, pushing things off my desk.
But so just to push on your process a little bit, because as folks in this community know, I'm a big creative process nerd.
Yeah.
So you get this challenge, then you start gathering evidence, so to speak, probably because it sounds like in first you're a little incredulous.
Mm-hmm.
Is that all happening in your, in your confined mind? I don't know what you would, right? But do you start to test some of these ideas at dinner parties or with a partner, or how does your thinking extend beyond your mind as you're considering this idea of extended mind?
Yeah, well, I would say that two things started happening. One was that as I got more familiar with this idea that Clark and Chalmers had proposed, I started becoming more aware, as one does. Once you have a concept, you can filter your experiences through that in a way that makes you see things in a different way. So I started to see how I and others were already thinking outside the brain. I've always been a big user of Post-it notes, for example. I'm a big believer in laying out ideas on physical space and being able to manipulate them and move them around. And this is, kind of a key aspect of the extended mind, this idea of cognitive offloading, that we gain benefits from getting ideas and information out of our heads and onto physical space, which is, I think, probably a key part of many design processes also. And then, so beyond seeing what I was already doing in terms of extending my mind, I also started to try out some of the techniques and strategies that I was learning about in the process of researching the book. For example, this is not going to strike anybody as so unusual, but I started, and I was writing the book during the pandemic also, so I started taking a lot of walks and taking a lot of bike rides to break up the work that I was doing and all that time I was spending in my house. And I could see playing out in front of me the very effects that the theory of the extended mind would predict, not just having a break from that very focused kind of attention that we have to pay when we're working, but also the embodied metaphor of moving forward, making progress, seeing new vistas and moving my body in such a way that it primed my mind to think in similar terms. I started to see the effects that I had been reading about in terms of how nature changes the way we think, what scientists call the attention restoration effect, that when we spend time in nature, the attention that we pay when we're in nature is this kind of diffuse and gentle focus that, again, is different from the kind of attention that we're paying when we're really focusing our attention in a hard-edged way on our computer or on something we're reading. So, it was kind of like a work and life coming together in a really interesting way, which is, what I really strive for as a writer. And so I really could see the extended mind taking shape before my eyes as I was studying it.
It sounds like, Annie, you and I have something in common, which is, I don't know if you would say it this way. I have a great hatred of hypocrisy. If I value something enough to tell others to do it, I better be willing to do it myself. And conversely, if I find that, theoretically, I value a nap, but I personally hate them, then I shouldn't extol the virtues of napping, even though theoretically it may be true. It's my disposition. I hate hypocrisy, but one way that manifests is I try stuff out. What is I would love to know more about, you mentioned biking, you mentioned walking. what was the process that brought you there? You're reading about somatic, processing, and you said, I should try that. Or you're just randomly on a walk and you have a new insight and you go, hang on, that reminds me of that study. How did the pieces start to come together? Was it a deliberative thing? Was it a prescriptive thing? Was it descriptive? What's your experience?
Yeah, I think that I was particularly struck by what I was reading about the metaphors that we use to understand the brain. And this was another kind of moment of realization where it was like, oh yeah, I really do that. I do think of the brain as a kind of computer, for example. I was doing all this reading about how, starting around the time of the cognitive revolution, this idea that the brain is like a computer really took root. And once you think about it that way, you can see it showing up all the time in our language and in the way that we treat our brains, and that was something that had been just beyond my awareness until it was brought into awareness by this reading that I was doing. And once I started thinking in these terms, that we equate the brain with a computer, we treat it as if it's a computer, as if we can just feed information into it, allow it to sort of chug away and, churn out the answer. That's how many of us go about working, like we sit down, we do our work, we don't get up until it's done. And we think that that's kind of,
until the battery dies and we've got to plug it back into the wall.
That's
right?
how you get work done. Right. And when I started thinking of the alternative that the extended mind brought to my attention, which is actually the brain is, very different from a computer. It's a quirky, idiosyncratic biological organ that evolved to do things that are very different from what we expect it to do, from what we ask it to do in our very knowledge-centric, conceptual, abstract world. It evolved to do things like sense and move the body, navigate through physical landscapes, interact with small groups of people. And the more we can make our intellectual or artistic work resemble those kinds of activities, the better suited our brain is to carry out those tasks, which is really different, again, from treating the brain like a computer that works exactly the same way, whether it's inside your office all day, or whether it's outside, or whether it's talking to another person, or in a solitary kind of setting. Like, all these contextual influences affect so deeply how we think and how well we think. And so that was just, once I had that realization that I'd been treating my brain like almost like a defective computer, like a computer that maybe didn't work as well as I would like, the understanding that actually it was this entirely different kind of entity was, it was like an insight that I couldn't go back from.
That's beautiful. Are you familiar with the work of Dr. Bo Lotto? He's a neuroscientist.
No.
He writes a lot about perception. He wrote a great book called Deviate, which I'd recommend. After you read Annie's book, you could read Bo's book. But he gave this example once in a workshop that I attended, where he talked about that there was this experiment long before PETA came into vogue, and attention to animals, mind you. But they put two cats on a what's it called, pole, and they just walked in circles around this pole, or rather, one walked, the other sat in a basket. But they have the exact same sensory experience of the world, right? All they're doing is seeing the world in circles it was a significant amount of time. The cat that sat in the basket eventually went blind. And what Dr. Lotto describes is how there's something about interacting with the world that's actually feeding our senses and our, I'm thinking about it as the brain is a biological, right? There's no reason if you carry two computers around in a circle,
right.
They're going to work, they're going to boot up just as slow or just as fast as they always do. But there's something about that not treating the brain as a biological organ really is. Hey, Karen asked a really good question, which actually I hear a lot in design fields as well. She said, it's hard to break away even when you know it's beneficial in the long run. Or that's a statement, but I think embedded in that statement is a question. How does one convince oneself to honor the, not even the extended mind, but just the mind as a organ that must be nurtured, when so much of our world is kind of demanding productivity, efficiency, reliability, focus, all of these things that aren't really organ-oriented kinds of language.
Right. Yeah, the pressures are huge, and the ideas and concepts are very deeply ingrained in our culture and therefore in us. So it is difficult to break away from what Andy Clark calls a neurocentric perspective. And I think the way to do it is in tune with the spirit of the extended mind, is to enact it, is to embody it, is to put it to use in your daily life. And then I think over time you can see that it actually works better, that the choice is not between being focused and productive or living and thinking in tune with your brain as it is truly constituted as a biological evolved organ. It's actually, those things ultimately work together, because I don't think our neurocentric perspective or our neurocentric practices work particularly well. They can lead to a lot of frustration, a lot of burnout, a lot of less creativity and less dynamism than we might like. And yet our reaction to that is often to kind of double down on what we've been doing. Like, well, I just have to sit at my desk for a few more hours to get this done, instead turning to these extraneural resources outside the brain resources, like the body, like doing something to change our physical setting, interacting with other people, engaging in a kind of conversation with our tools, or with the material world, all these things that are such richer avenues, to getting what we want done, than just sort of trying to do it with our brains alone.
Yeah. I find that a lot of times there's this strange compartmentalization, and it takes someone a trip to the hospital before they realize that the way they're treating their, I mean, no kidding, multiple, friends that I have, or entrepreneurs that I know in my network, the reason that actually they, I take, for example, Aisha Dozy. She's the founder and CEO of Bossy Cosmetics. She's got 4 of Oprah's favorite products in her cosmetic line. Aisha's a rock star designer. And she was in my class at Stanford a few years ago, and I interviewed her for a podcast about female founders. And one of the things that she told me was she grew up in a single parent home in the Bronx. She was good at math, and so she got told from a young age, you got to go into investment banking. She became one of the youngest managing directors of Goldman Sachs ever. And it wasn't until she was in the hospital for hypertension that she started to pay attention to her love of color, for example, which had no manifestation in the world of spreadsheets whatsoever, right? But it wasn't until it was, and I know another woman, Diarra Bousso, a Senegalese entrepreneur, is an incredible entrepreneur, and she had the same kind of story. It wasn't until she was in the hospital that she decided to make a change. And I wonder if it just, that observation, those couple data points are making me think there's this almost arbitrary compartmentalization. We think about what we're doing with our mind as separate from our body, whatever, until we're in the hospital that we go, do I want to keep doing that with my mind?
Yeah. I tell a similar story to that, Jeremy, where there's a woman who, gosh, now I'm not remembering her name, but she's become an expert on mindfulness and in particular interoceptive awareness, tuning into the internal sensations that are flowing through your body all the time. But before that, she was a workaholic who absolutely, viewed the body as an obstacle to getting work done, as many of us do. You power through and you push aside those internal promptings, until she was working like 12-hour days to working full time, but also completing a PhD and writing her dissertation, until one day she threw up on her keyboard, and it was just like, okay, I think I'm getting a message here from my body, that this is not sustainable. And so she ultimately now teaches other people about again, mindfulness, practicing a body scan as a way of tuning into those interoceptive sensations and listening to what they have to tell us. So yeah, sometimes it does take something dramatic like that to get our attention.
That's fascinating. I've got to ask you about, I know I've already warned Annie, so she knows that I'm taking the conversation in this direction, but one of the chapters that I personally found most, I think, what's the right word? Vindicating. No,
okay. Yeah.
was the chat. Sorry, it takes me a long time to think of the right word. I'm a very particular person, but was the chapter on imitation. And I would love to give you the opportunity, if you're willing, to share with folks a little bit about some of the research and science behind what is the role of imitation and how does that affect our extended minds and ourselves and our capacities.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that you found that part of the book interesting, Jeremy. I mean, when I set out to write this book, The Extended Mind, I didn't know that it would end up being so much a cultural critique, that it would really be pushing back against so many of the currents that dominate our society and the way we think. But this part about imitation, this section that concerns imitation, certainly did end up being that, because imitation, I mean, even just the very word, I think we have a kind of reaction to it, like imitation what is imitation? What are the connotations we have for imitation? That it's second rate, it's copying, it's maybe even plagiarizing, it's late.
Bad. It's bad. Don't do it, right?
It's bad. Yeah, it's bad.
Yeah.
And conversely, we celebrate things that are original and innovative and things that those figures in our society who come up with things that are for the first time, who are trailblazers. So it was very surprising to me to learn in the course of researching that section on imitation, what a illustrious and sort of venerable history imitation has as a way of learning and mastering a craft. That our views that we hold about imitation today are not representative of many cultures from the past. So Greek and Roman education systems were actually founded on imitation, and the idea was you don't just strike out on your own knowing nothing and come up with something brilliant. You very attentively and very in the most detail-oriented way possible, get inside the work of the masters, the people whose work we so admire and we so has so inspired us, and we get to know it from the inside, even by translating a particular speech, translating it from one language to another, or writing it in a style that is different from the one it was originally written in, or and memorizing it, and in every kind of way coming at it so that it so intimately that it becomes almost a part of you, and then you can begin to put your own twist, your own stamp on the craft that you've now mastered by kind of getting inside the mind of the person who created that work that you so admire.
A couple anecdotes just for as a fellow aficionado. I heard someone say recently that Bob Dylan, there was no one more versed in the history of Americana music than Bob Dylan. In the early 1960s. Certainly now, right? But in the early 1960s, nobody was as deep into the catalogs of Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, these legends than Bob Dylan was. And you go, well, is it any wonder that he's the one who broke on the scene as the vanguard? What all of his friends knew is he's the guy. And I would argue, by the way, it's similar to practice in a way, right? If you think about it, right? Getting deep into the works of the masters, as you say, I think is similar to practice in that it's about repetition, it's about exposure, it's about muscle memory, and it's a fascinating thing. I heard somebody say even recently that Bob Dylan, I haven't seen the article, otherwise I'd link it, but someone was telling me that Bob Dylan was interviewed recently, and he said many times when I'm meeting someone, they think I'm talking to them, but I'm actually singing this song I've heard in my mind, because he said, I sing it enough times that it becomes my own and I start to change it.
Huh.
And apparently
Huh.
it's a tactic of his, even to this day, to just kind of repeat something over and over and over again until it kind of becomes his own. You hear
Yeah, yeah.
that famous clip of Paul Simon too, where he basically said that about, there's this old soul song that kind of gave him the breakthrough on the bridge over troubled water. So he was listening
Oh,
to this gospel record, and all of a sudden he found these kinds of chord progressions resolving what was a creative block at that point.
right. But he had to inhabit, in a sense, the music of someone else before he could invent his own. Yeah, I'll add one more example, Jeremy, which is, I once heard in an interview the painter Chuck Close say that no one had painted more Franz Klein's than he had, including Klein himself, because he was so obsessed with Klein's work and so wanted to understand how is it done, that he just made one after another copies of Klein's work, which I think is how many artists learn their craft, but so instead of seeing imitation as something lazy or second rate, we could see it as an homage, to the masters that we admire so much, and also a step in our own journey as artists or creators,
Absolutely. What do you find yourself? What was the biggest change to your own approach to your, you started the conversation by saying you often were in your own mind, you're often doing your own research. So, I'm just bringing kind of a mind-centeredness to this. What would you say has been the most profound shift for you in terms of how you approach or thinking about your own mind, or how you interact with your own mind, having taken all this research?
The concept that's been most useful to me, and it kind of applies across the many types of mental extensions that we can potentially take advantage of, is an idea from Andy Clark, the philosopher who is the one who really went the farthest with this idea of the extended mind. He said something about how human beings are intrinsically loopy creatures. And what he meant by that was, he was again kind of drawing a distinction between the kind of intelligence that characterizes computers on the one hand, and the kind of intelligence that characterizes human beings, our biological intelligence. There's something about our kind of intelligence that benefits from being looped outside our own brains through some other medium and then back into our own minds, and it gets enriched and augmented and complexified during this looping process. And that loop could be, we loop it through our bodies, we start gesturing and moving, and in that way we transform the ideas that we're working with. Or we could be looping it through our physical surroundings. We go outside, we look at the trees, we kind of get a new perspective on what we're thinking about. Or we could be looping it through the minds of other people, and this is, Andy Clark says something funny about how we would think it was bizarre if a computer operated by printing out, it's the latest version of what it was working on, showing it to other computers who might then mark it up and, and then feeding it back into itself. That wouldn't make any sense at all for a computer, but that's how our human intelligence works. We see something differently when we cognitively offload it onto physical space and we see it outside of our own head. We can hear ideas differently when we hear them spoken by other people, So I now think of my own creative life in terms of how many loops can I create in how many different diverse ways, so that information and those ideas aren't staying inert just inside my own head.
I love that. How many loops can I create? Reminds me when Dan Pink joined the show months ago. One of the things that he mentioned was, when he's working on a manuscript, he always reads it out loud to his wife, and then his wife reads it out loud to him. And something happens when you read it yourself out loud that doesn't happen when you're reading it in your head. And then something totally different happens when you hear somebody reading it. He said for his latest book, between the two of them, they probably read the book out loud 50 times.
Well, I give his wife a lot of credit for her patience.
No kidding,
But
right?
that's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, right? Like, why would changing the form change the way you think about it? But it does. And so that to me is just more evidence that we need to work with our brains as they are, instead of imposing some idea of how brains should work, which is what we do when we expect them to act like computers, and then we get distressed or disappointed when they don't.
Right, right. What is the what's your go-to when you're stuck? What do you do? Do you have what do you do?
Yeah, I do. I'm not sure this is extended mind related, but the thing I do is I close my computer and then I go do some kind of housework, which is some kind of task, which is always awaiting me, like folding laundry or doing dishes. This would, this drawing from another area of psychology, this would be probably something like incubation or activating the default network, wherein we're doing something that is occupies us enough to kind of allow our minds to wander, but not so demanding that we're really focusing on it. And I almost always find that I come back after an episode like that with a clear idea of what I need to do next. And I got some laundry folded or some dishes done. So I find that to be a very
legit win-win situation.
Yeah.
Kim, just for the record, you'll know that you're in good company. Kim Scott told me she pulls weeds.
Oh, yeah, right.
Said I just go weed the garden, and it's a great.
Yeah.
She said, yeah, and I get weeds, which I really like, but I also break through, right? But I think to me, it's actually, these are great examples. Do it whether it's folding laundry, pulling weeds, or whatever. They're all. Albert Einstein would pick up the violin, right? They're all. To me, it's actually really important in normalizing, in almost the way I think about it as redefining work. If you think of work as I'm at the computer looking at the screen, and therefore when I'm not at the computer looking at the screen, it's not work, you'll never wield the laundry pile as a weapon. You'll never wield the weeding as a weapon, right? You see that as, but I think there's a lot of us who, maybe because of the way we've been institutionalized, to use a provocative word, we have very, very narrow definitions of work. And hearing these stories is actually, I think, part of the rehabilitation process.
Right.
Then you go, oh, Einstein played an instrument. I guess I have permission too. Annie Murphy Paul folds her laundry. It's like these stories actually really help. One of my favorite examples is, Amos Tversky said, someone asked him, how do you and Danny come up with such fascinating experiments? And he said, the secret to doing good research is to always be underemployed. You waste years by not being able to waste hours.
Wow, that's lovely. Yeah, I have the story in the book about how he and Dan Kahneman came up with most of their ideas on walks together. So that kind of moderate physical activity, plus the social interaction, plus being outside. How could,
the trifecta. But I think the thing is, like, if you look, I can't help but wonder if their colleagues at Hebrew University looked out the window and thought, those guys are slacking.
Right.
By the way, they're reinventing economic theory, right? But it doesn't look like work. They're not sitting at the desk with the big dusty books out, And so as long as our definitions are that narrow, we don't value it. If I'm looking over my shoulder, hoping nobody sees me taking a walk, good luck for that to be a productive incubation session, right?
Right. I think we really need to shift our ideas of what productivity looks like.
When you've had so many interesting contributions here, do you have any questions for Annie? I just tried to unmute you. See if you can unmute yourself. I don't know if you're able to.
Yeah, I think I probably have 1,000 questions for Annie. I started off 10 years ago after my wife died. And I now had what I was starting to say, Jennifer Roberts, the art historian, calls patient immersion. And it connects to what Einstein said when he was asked, how do you do so much more than scientists who have the same IQ you do? He said, it's very simple. I stay on the problem longer which means you start to understand a lot of the nuances that you wouldn't have seen if you hadn't had a patient immersion. And he said, if you haven't seen a problem for 5 to 9 different prisms, I guarantee you, you can't understand it. And we all could benefit from understanding those two major truths, because like J.P. Morgan, the original J.P. Morgan said, wherever you're going, get there as fast as you can go to find out how much further you can go. And we don't acclimate, and we don't get to where we can get to. And it's like Thomas Edison said, if each of us understood what we were capable of, we would astound ourselves. And now in the modern world, we have the chance to reinvent human capital. And I guess I would ask you, Annie, whether Josh Bersin made the comment a couple of years ago to top HR professionals, if you break specialties into the vertical specialties and the top of the T. And like Steve Jobs always said, you go out to the tails to find out where the future is. And Josh Bersin was telling, because the world is moving so fast in a VUCA world, Josh Bersin told the top HR professionals in 2019, if you don't go to the top of the T, you will not be top HR professionals in 5 to 10 years, because your business units are moving so fast that you can't keep up. And Annie, I would ask you the question, because I believe that 10 to 15% of human capital now has to be harvesting the top of the T across the continuum in order to create new nuances, new knowledge, and new specialties. And then it gets all blended together into what the crypto guys call communities of interest and belonging, which can now be more attuned to each other.
Can I ask you what you mean by the top of the T? I'm not familiar with that phrase.
Well, I know that's the problem with suitcase words. There are all kinds of top of the T. People like Muhammad El-Arian would break it into the left of the top of the T is where the French Revolution might be coming, because of how much instability is in the system. The right side is good. The top of the T is the idea that we spend all our times out of the Industrial Revolution being told we have to become specialists in vertical specialties, because that's where all the value was during the last 100 years.
I see.
The top of the T is spreading out. Yeah,
I
go ahead.
see.
Oh, I see.
So-
I thought you were
I was just doing a visual, not a timeout. Sorry.
And that Steve Jobs used to say he would go to out to the tails of the distribution at the top of the T,
I see.
going to the Arc Laboratory, et cetera, and finding the things that became Apple. But that's no longer true in the VUCA world and the new levels of AI, which have now started to understand the hidden layers of meaning. And are now distributing a virus around the world in the last couple of weeks called stability diffusion, where they create images out of nothing. They beat the game of Go that they didn't think was possible. They won 7-1. And all this stuff is going around the world, and it's now been released, and we have no idea where all this is going or what it means for all of us and how our futures are going to unfold. And so I guess I would ask you what you think about where else, other than the traditional ways, whether it's the schools that have not adapted from the Industrial Revolution to human capital, et cetera, where you see the most productive ways of enhancing human capital, because we can all do far more than we think we can.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. What it made me think about was actually back to this idea that Jeremy brought up of imitation, because one of the benefits of imitation is that it allows us to have access to any number of potential solutions or potential approaches to a problem. We don't have to tie ourselves to just one. The world is nothing but examples for us to adapt for our own use, if we're willing to get over our kind of prejudice against imitation. The other thing you said that I really loved was that you can't understand a problem until you've looked through 5 to 9 prisms or lenses on it. And
Right.
that really made me think, I'm probably thinking too literally here, but I was thinking about the research I cover in the book about the value, again, of cognitive offloading, getting
Right.
ideas and information out of your head, and something that designers do so well, which is to make actually a three-dimensional model of what they're thinking about, what they're working on. And when we do that, when we interact with the physical material object rather than just these abstractions in our head, we bring this whole suite of embodied resources. You know, we can move our body around that model. We can reach in, we can move things around, we can see what it looks like from far away and close up, you know, and all these things that we do so effortlessly. They don't use up a lot of cognitive bandwidth. So that leaves a lot of mental resources for the higher order thinking that we want to be doing. That kind of physical navigation, and instead of the kind of navigation that we were so used to doing on our screens, is a really generative kind of tool that gets lost when we only think inside our head. So I just wanted to make a plug there for one of those prisms being like a physical interaction with the ideas that we're thinking about.
Do you know Bo Lotto?
That's
Was
what
who
I asked
Jeremy
a
was
second
just
ago.
mentioning? Yeah, got it. Clearly, I've got to look into this guy.
Yeah.
No, Bo Lotto is a neuroscientist. He wrote a
Yes.
book called Deviate, and it's very hard to find it, like some other things, like Beth Comstock on VUCA put another A at the end for anxiety, but you can only find it in one article, so it takes you 2 weeks to find it again. Bo Lotto has a phrase I think you would really appreciate, which he calls it not A. And by not A, he doesn't mean you should get off into the logic of A and not A. He means if you're trying to get to a new fitness peak, because the world is changing and now our fitness peaks, so we have to climb new fitness peaks faster and faster and faster. He said the idea that you can leapfrog from one fitness peak to another is just flat out wrong. You have to go out of the space you're in to not A, meaning you're in A. You need to take a baby step to not A, and it's only through a series of not A's that you're ever going to get to where you want to go, because it's movement.
Well, I have a personal rule that if two interesting people recommend the same book, then it's something I've got to check out. So
Man, long distance high five here, my friend. Long distance high five.
Well,
Hey,
I spent 10 years reinventing myself. I was a non-creative. This isn't a plug for me, a non-creative. And I'll tell you one more quick story, because I think it's illustrative of something that could benefit everybody around the world. I had gotten an assignment to place the holy grail of retirement that a friend of mine developed. And I was sitting there for 9 days trying to solve a particular problem. And I was frustrated. And then all of a sudden, I remembered a book by Warren Berger called Beautiful Questions. And he was saying you have to ask beautiful questions, because they can, even if they're dumb questions, they could be brilliant now, brilliant 5 years from now, but you have to ask them. So after 9 days, and I'll try and speed this up because I know I'm very convoluted. After 9 days of focusing on these two things, I asked a dumb question, which in the problem, it was who issues US Treasury securities? And in the next 120 seconds, Annie, because I had prepared what Professor William Dugan calls the intelligent memory, it keeps expanding over time. And if you have a growth mindset, et cetera, from Carol Dweck, and you get new neuroplasticity, develops new parts of your brain, and information ricochets around your brain in different ways. So the quick story is that in the next 120 seconds, I left my project behind. In 120 seconds, I had no idea how I went down the cascade and went right to one of the major problems of the US Treasury among 100 of them, and suddenly came up with what one of the biggest financial firms in Europe later called a huge solution to one of those problems, and they were going to take it directly to President Obama. And the idea was that all of a sudden, if you build your mind to let the cascade, when a certain type of information now hits it, because it ricochets around your mind in new ways. And it had nothing to do with me, it just happened. So the last piece of it that I think you should all take a lesson from is when somebody asked me, I'm working with a spatial computing company that's created a 3-dimensional view of the world. And he flipped out when I told him the real message here is not that I created it, not that it was a $500 billion solution and they were going to take it directly to President Obama. It was that I was a middling finance guy of no particular reputation. And yet I had created this out of the way in which the best in the world had not been able to see it because they were elsewhere. And all of a sudden, you have a toolkit that we can start to develop for human capital around the world. And we can show people and teach them how to use these new toolkits. And they can go off in different directions and create new future selves. And I lived it. So
that's wonderful. That's great. Jeremy, do we have other questions there for people?
We have one more. I think Roy would like to ask a question as well. Thanks, Wynn, for your contribution. That's awesome. I love hearing it. Roy, what are you wondering?
Well, the title of your book and even the little intro made me think that you were going to talk about one of two other phenomenons, and I'm wondering if they came up in your research and whatnot. One is that we have neurons in our gut, right? Like, and we have neurons in our heart too. Like we have neurons kind of sprinkled outside of our skull. And we use them, and it's in language. You trust your gut, listen to your heart. Like you have processing happening outside of up here. And I'm wondering if that was part of it. And then the other thing was the whole group think phenomenon, like that, a room full of people can fly a plane, right? Like, and they've done all sorts of interesting dynamics of large groups of people with minute input are able to do things that you wouldn't expect without really communicating. It's not like everyone was saying, go left, go right. It was just, and I'm sure you know these experiments. There's a number of these things where they take a group of people and they do fascinating things and they can't figure out how it's working. Like, they're just like, we know it does work. There's, 50 people in a room and they're in a flight simulator able to fly a plane together. And we don't know what that's about. So I'm just wondering, either of those things came up, is that part of your?
Yeah, I think the book addresses both of those, maybe in a slightly different way from how you phrased it. There's a chapter on interoception, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, which is not so much about the gut-brain connection, but more about the fact that we have this flow of internal sensation, just like we were collecting, sensations from the external world. We also have internal sensors, and yet, our very Cartesian, mind-body dualism kind of culture tells us that the body doesn't really have very much to contribute to intelligent thought. And the research that I pulled together on interoception, I think, would argue something quite different, that actually our interoceptive sense is the repository of all these non-conscious patterns and assemblages of knowledge that we've gathered without being aware of it, just going through our daily lives. And if that knowledge is non-conscious, how is it that we have access to it? How can we get access to it? It's through these promptings of the body, which work faster than conscious thought. So that's how people are able to act on their gut and make informed choices, or superior choices to those that they might make or be able to make if they were trying to think through every step, So the chapter on interoception does touch on that kind of bodily wisdom. And then there is a chapter as well on thinking with groups and how it is that we can foster a kind of collective intelligence, an intelligence exhibited by a group that is greater than the intelligence of any one of its members. And what was interesting to me about that is that it has a kind of woo-woo, like almost kind of
a quantum effect or something. Like, what's happening?
Yeah. But you can actually break down the mechanisms by which collective intelligence asserts itself. One of them being this idea of transactive memory, that one biological brain can only hold so much knowledge, but as long as you know where to locate that information in the brains of other people, you've effectively multiplied how much knowledge you have access to. So teams that have a robust transactive memory system, meaning they have an accurate and updated understanding of who knows what are much better able to get things done together in an intelligent way. So, you know, I love when science can sort of demystify something that seems hard to understand, and then it turns out that there are very concrete kind of mechanisms by which those things operate.
So I just want to be clear that so you're saying there's some sort of like network effect of the interaction that people subconsciously or consciously, I mean, are you saying subconsciously are aware of others' knowledge? What's the connection mechanism, I guess, is what I'm not following.
Yeah,
Between
well,
the brains.
I mean, to bring it down to earth, I mean, the psychologist who came up with the idea of transactive memory, Daniel Wegner, he started thinking about it when he got married and moved in with his new wife, and realized that over time, and this wasn't necessarily conscious, they were splitting up the sort of mental and physical labor of the household, such that his wife was taking care of and knew about certain areas of the home, and he knew about certain other areas, and together they were more intelligent and more effective together than they could be as individuals. And then you take that and multiply it by however many people are in a team getting something done, and you can see how the limits of the individual brain can be transcended.
Got it. Yeah, sometimes it's called flow, especially in sports, right? There's flow of a team where they're just organically working as a whole. Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Yeah. And just to add one more thing, I find the concept that psychologists have come up with they literally call it groupiness. Like, what is the quality that characterizes a group that is no longer an assemblage of individuals, but in some way a single entity, you know, and how do we create groupiness? And again, it seems like almost like kind of a mystical thing, like sometimes a group has it and sometimes it doesn't, but it turns out that we can break it down into certain strategies and approaches that do generate groupiness. Thanks for your question.
That phrase, groupiness.
Groupiness.
Thank you, Roy, for your
Groupiness
comments.
and
That's
groupiness.
awesome. Your earlier comments reminded me of actually our next guest, Naomi Bagdonas, told me the other day, the mind thinks, but the body knows.
Oh, that's awesome.
I thought that was really lovely expression.
Yeah.
Annie, you have the last, call it 4 minutes. Is there anything else you'd like to share with the crew while we're all here together?
Yeah, I think I'd let you know, I really am an enthusiast for a champion, like a advocate for the idea of the extended mind. It's made such a difference in my life, and I find it just endlessly fascinating and generative. And I thought I would share one of my favorite things about it, which is that although when it was proposed, and even still to this day, the idea of the extended mind can sound kind of wacky and out there and maybe a little futuristic, you know, it often gets applied to our devices. That's how many people might have encountered the idea. You know, we extend our minds with our smartphones, for example. But my favorite thing about the extended mind is the fact that it actually reconnects us with it's actually a much more ancient kind of wisdom. It puts us in touch with who we always were as human beings, and it's the separation of our intelligence from the fact that we are, you know, embedded in physical bodies and ensconced in physical spaces and fundamentally social, you know, in the way that we interact with other people. This is our nature as human beings, you know what I mean? And the idea that we were ever some kind of disembodied intellect was always a mistake. And so the extended mind kind of reminds us of something that we never should have forgotten. You know, that's how I think of it. And if we do still have a little time, Jeremy, we were going to do something, just sort of a shout out to people, a question to people who's a figure that you have benefited from imitating. Can we put that in the chat and just see what people have to say? Because I would love to see those answers.
Done. Yes. It's in the chat now. Which artist or thinker have you imitated with productive results? If you want to close with just a short story about an artist or thinker you have imitated. I'll tell mine. Seth Godin, I read years ago, he said, write a blog post per day. And I literally Googled that day that I read that, how do you start a blog? And so I just do it Monday through Friday because weekends got to take some time off. But anyway, for me, that was a transformative practice. Actually, my blog is now my external hard drive for my brain. It's actually where all of the things that I remember are.
Yeah, I would say for myself, and it's not any particular person, it's just a habit that I have, and maybe it's a habit, Jeremy, like you have of writing in a blog. But when I'm sitting down to writing something, I often take a few minutes beforehand to read a passage, and it can be, it doesn't have to be related to what I'm writing. It's that I read a passage from a writer whose voice I really admire, and maybe whose voice in some way connects to, or I think would be appropriate for or suited for the project that I'm working on. And just to get the rhythms and the cadences of that voice in my head, it's not, again, like imitation. I think one reason that we look down upon it is that we imagine it's like making a carbon copy of the original, when really it's about getting to know someone else's work so well and digesting it so fully that we can sort of, contribute it back out into the world in a different form. And so I often like to read sometimes Annie Dillard, sometimes Michael Pollan, sometimes even the novelist John Updike. I find his work so beautiful and so precise. And if that's what I'm looking for, then I'll read a passage from one of his novels before I sit down to write myself. And it's not about copying them or imitating them. It's maybe about inspiring myself through their example.
I think Thoreau once said, first we read and then we write. As a daily practice. So that's great. Annie, we can't thank you enough for sharing your wisdom with us, your research. It's quite compelling, quite inspiring, and validating for those of us who felt my mind's not only in here. So thank you for taking the time to share with us. And community of Masters of Creativity, thanks for joining us today. We'll post this to our YouTube channel as we often do. And until next time, everyone have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving.
Thanks, Jeremy. This has been so fun.
Yes, likewise. See you all soon.